welcome back to Anna Rose Reads the podcast. I am your host, Anna, and today I am sharing a conversation with someone who I would consider to be kind of a bucket list kind of guest, an all star guest, I guess you can say. I am chatting with Mr. Ronald Malfi, the author of one of my favorite books ever, Come With Me. But we are going to be talking about his upcoming release, the book that's out on shelves today, April 15th, Senseless. You may know him from some of his other titles like The Narrows or Black House, but for me, his writing really, really grabbed my attention with Come With Me, and I have kind of been obsessed ever since. Ronald has a extensive backlist that I have not quite made it all the way through yet, which is a blessing and a curse. It's always nice to have more to read from your favorite authors, but I do feel a little bit like a fake fan having not read all of his stuff. I can say, though, that Senseless is a bonkers novel. It is insane. It is one of the most intense things that I think that I've read from Malfi so far. Kind of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, and a lot of it sticks. And that's mostly what we talk about. We talk about his writing process, his inspiration, kind of the what in the hell were you thinking moments, because there's a few of those, and everything in between. Ronald is somebody who is a musician as well, so we talk a little bit about music towards the end. But I do need to preface this conversation with a confession. Unfortunately, we got hit with the infamous technological problem curse for this interview. I've been fortunate enough that it hasn't really happened to me since starting this podcast. Unfortunately, it did make an appearance for this interview. I did, fortunately, however, get about a solid 30 minutes of conversation recorded soundly and without complication. So it is a little bit of a condensed conversation, and I quite literally finished asking my last written question before things kind of went sideways. So you'll probably hear a longer outro from me kind of recapping what is going on in the next few weeks for Mr. Malfi, since we did kind of lose connection on the end part of our conversation. As normal, I'm sure if you've listened to my episodes by now, we kind of talk about what the author has coming up next, what they're working on, all that kind of stuff. But I did lose that part of that conversation. So you'll have to bear with me and unfortunately hear my voice instead of Ronald Malfi's. With that being said, this is still a really excellent conversation, I think, about his book Senseless. If you've read it, you'll get a lot of the references that we make. If you haven't read it yet, you might want to circle back to this once you have. It's a very book heavy conversation. But yeah, so now that all of that housekeeping's out of the way, I can shut up now and you all can enjoy the episode. Thanks, guys. Hi, Ronald. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, literally anytime. And I've wanted to talk to you for a while now. I've been a fan for a few years now. And it seemed like a great opportunity because your book, Senseless, is coming out in a few weeks, which is very exciting. How are you feeling about the approaching publication day?
I'm very excited. Just like you said, I think it's very cool. I'm very excited about this book. It's a little bit different than some of the stuff I've done in the past, and it's a little out there, I think. And I'm excited to see how my readers react to it, and to see if it even attracts any new readership, because it is a bit of a departure from the typical genre that I write. But yeah, I'm excited.
Good, good. Well, in case people don't know who you are, I know you from your books like Come With Me, The Narrows. You have a huge, extensive backlist of books, but I think Come With Me has to be my favorite from you. If people don't know you, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the folks who maybe aren't quite as educated as I am?
Well, I am Ronald Malfi. I am a novelist. I believe Senseless might be my 20th book, my 20th novel, maybe. I've been writing ever since my first book was published a year out of college. I write what I guess my publishers cautiously call horror. But I feel that I walk, I straddle a thin line of being a horror writer, a thriller, suspense writer. Not all my books have overtly supernatural elements, and sometimes when they do, it's questionable if they exist at all in the first place. Um, but everything I write does tend to take a dark bend. As Grandma once asked me, Ronald, why don't you write something nice? I say, Grandma, they all start off as love stories, but they go south. Uh,
Yeah, they
and
do.
so yeah, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Senseless in particular goes very south, and that is your book that's coming out with Titan Books on April 15th. And to kind of summarize the book, I mean, I'll just say it now and get it out the way. It's the closest that I've had in a reading experience to where it felt like I was like reading True Detective on the page. If, people who watch the show, if you know that feeling, it's kind of gritty, it's mysterious. But basically it's best to go in pretty blind to this book, I'd say. There's a body that's found, and then there's three separate storylines of three very different individuals, that kind of follow their own path and then maybe come together, maybe don't. Read to find out. And that's all you really need to know, honestly, because this book takes some turns, and all I can say is when I finished it, I just wanted to scream like, "What the fuck?" like multiple times. I don't know if that's what you were going for, but that's what happened.
I said that when I was writing it a couple of times.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I can imagine that you would. So, do you want to go ahead and talk just like in broad strokes? I mean, it's a very broad question I'm about to ask, but the inspiration behind Senseless in particular, like what was the seed of the idea, the kernel that started it all?
Like you said, it's kind of got these three separate storylines, and uh, initially when I came up with the idea, it was just the one storyline. It was just about the detective finding
Yeah.
this body that's mutilated in the desert outside of LA, and then he goes back and well, he realizes that murder resembles one that happened a year prior to a case that he thought he'd solved. So he realizes something's off, and he goes back to the husband of the first murder victim, and you realize they have like a friendship now, and they as strained as it might be, and they start to piece together how this second body could have come about. Um, and I thought about that for a while, and I've never really been just a sort of, kind of take a trope or take a genre and just go with what you expect in it. So I wasn't going to write like a straight cop thriller. I liked where the story was going, so I just sat on it for a while. When it came time to actually think about this story more seriously and say, all right, this is something I think I'm going to write. The other two storylines seemed to kind of materialize out of nowhere, and I realized, no, I want to tell this sort of as like an ensemble where it's these three disparate stories that run parallel to each other. These three main characters, and you don't really even know how they connect or if they connect, and just run them through in telling this tale and kind of weaving their stories in and out of each other and seeing how they affect each other's storylines. And once I started doing that, I realized that it would allow me to play with some of the subgenres within dark fiction that I write. So with the cop storyline, I've got my procedural noir detective story. With Maureen's storyline, who is a an author. She's a one-time novelist who's about to be engaged to a Hollywood producer. Her story becomes this sort of domestic thriller. And then I've got my friend Toby, who thinks he is a human fly. His storyline kind of lets me dip into more of the gothic horror, and I love that I could kind of play in all three of those wheelhouses in the same book. And it tested me as a writer, just because the characters are vastly different, and it tested my the ability to write in the style that comports with each of those subgenres I was playing with. So I had a lot of fun with that part. And once I realized that's what I was doing, I'm like, yeah, all right, this has got to be the book. This has got to be what I write next.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's kind of, it's interesting to me the way that you talk about it because on paper, by no means should this like make as much sense as it does, right? Like it sounds like very categorized stories that you're like, how the hell would that fit together? And you even said like in your writing style, you tried to, pick up on similar like tropes or themes that those kind of subgenres typically have. And I would say you did so successfully, but it all still really worked well together. And I have to ask, like, was it ever a point where you were like, well, maybe these will be like novellas in a collection that will tie together? Because in my mind, sometimes the way that you just described it, that's how it would go. But to have this cohesive narrative is really impressive despite how different each subgenre is, if that makes sense.
I had written a book a few years ago called Ghostwritten,
Yeah.
and it's if you ask my publisher, they're going to tell you it's four novellas, all centered around these haunted books that take place in these different worlds, and it's a collection of four novellas. When I wrote it as a novel with these, and each section of the book is a different story. So that's kind of how I was thinking of it. Um, I don't know. Had I not written that book that way, I don't know if it would have occurred to me to tackle Senseless in the way I did. But I knew going into it that it certainly was going to be a novel. I didn't want to keep the storylines, I didn't want to just have them be short stories or novellas that don't interconnect. And the connection in Ghost Written is tenuous, but it's there, and it's kind of fun to find and hunt out the Easter eggs on how the stories connect. Um, with Senseless, it's much more solidly connected by the end of the book.
Yeah.
But it was fun getting there because I don't outline and I don't plot
Oh
my stuff.
man.
So I'm writing these kind of wondering where they go myself until I get to the end. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Well, with this one in particular, I imagine it had to be a particularly interesting writing experience because of the different, twists and turns that you take with it. And quite frankly, it's a very there's a lot of action, there's a lot of external action, but it's also a very psychological novel. And I think that that's part of the reason why it has that gritty feel to it that I related to like shows like True Detective. Did you watch like the first season?
So the first season and the third and fourth. I think I
Yeah.
skipped the second for whatever reason. Yeah, I love the show. The show's great, and I get what you're saying. There's a certain tone
Yeah.
to what they have, and yeah, it was like I said, a different kind of approach than the stuff I'd normally done, and it was a different approach to writing it. Normally, I have to, because I don't outline, I have to
Mhm.
kind of write and as if I'm the first reader, and I
Yeah.
that means I have to do it in order, right? Chapter one, chapter two, chapter three. Um, there was a part in this in writing Senseless that I just got hung up in doing it that way, and I'm watching the clock tick because I have a deadline, like I got to write something. Um, so because these storylines are separate until like the end where they cross over, I was able to jump into one storyline and write that all the way through
Hmm.
and then come back and fill in the gaps. So I wasn't wasting time. But it was a weird way to write. And in my head, I tend to picture it a little out of order than it actually is in the book because of that. But
Yeah. No, I
so
can
yeah,
see that.
if I say something that's wrong,
Oh
just
no,
that's the
no.
reason.
But I think that's kind of the appeal. Like I really enjoyed that aspect of the book because like it is linear in some ways and in some ways it's not. In particular when we talk about Toby, it doesn't piecing together his time isn't quite as easy as our other two characters that you mentioned. And I also wanted to hit on this too that you mentioned that you felt like you could hit on more of those like horror gothic notes with Toby, but I have to say I picked up on some of that with the detective narrative because of his background, right? Like he's a grieving person and he's kind of haunted by his previous actions, and that's really like what's driving him with a lot of this stuff. And that's something that you wrote really, really well in Come With Me, that kind of like haunted, grieving person. Did you writing in those headspaces, whether it's the grieving person or the strange guy like Toby the Fly, how does that affect you when you're writing from those perspectives?
Um, well, first, one thing I want to touch on because I'm kind of realizing it as you're saying that you compare the grief aspect and Come With Me, and then the grief aspect for the detective segment in Senseless. And what I realize I do is I kind of both of those have not just the grief and the ghost element to it, which you would anticipate in dark fiction for a grief story. They both have this hint of a cosmic element to them as well. Where Come With Me, it's a bit of a shake on time and place, that the wall becomes thin. And it's similar with the Detective Bill Rennie in Senseless, with Rennie's story, when he starts thinking about his deceased wife and her concept of the universe and how it works and how it's not actually infinite, but there's a repeating pattern to certain things, and that could explain. He tries to wrap his head around what's going on. That could explain things. It does have a cosmic element to it. For some reason, I find that grief and the cosmos tend to go hand in hand, and that's a, I don't know, a quirk of mine, I guess. Um, but then writing characters like, Toby, here's a 22-year-old kid who thinks he's a housefly. He believes his mother is a spider who's been feeding off him for years, and when he finally runs away and he's living on the streets and he goes into this club, he meets a woman that he believes is a vampire. Clearly, this dude is not operating, like correctly. Um, and that was a lot of fun because there is nothing reliable about his
Yeah.
chapters in the book at all. And it brings some of the, it certainly introduces a lot of the horror elements to the story, but it was he was icky. He's
Yeah.
an icky kind of guy. Um, the thing with him is he's also, to a degree, despite what he does in the book, he's a bit of a victim
Yeah.
of his own mental illness, and and also by his living conditions growing up with his mother, which you could, figure out wasn't the best. Um, so there's an element of pity I think I had in writing him, and I think it makes it kind of, I don't know. There's a certain, you could kind of feel that heartbeat of that in that character. Conversely, with like a character like Landon. So Landon is the stepson of Maureen. She's the second storyline, the writer who's getting engaged to the producer. The stepson is I think I have him in his mid to late 20s or so. He's just this kind of Tom Ripley-esque, bumbling around, doesn't want to get a job, expatriate, but that's the guys he puts on, but he's really just, he does too many drugs, and you know, he's just a terrible person, but he's deliberately so. Like, he's
Yeah.
almost worse than Toby, who is kind of, because he knows exactly what he's doing and he's deliberately making people uncomfortable, as opposed to Toby, who doesn't seem to know when he's making people uncomfortable. And that's the difference. And it was, I always had to keep myself in check when I was in each of their heads, because they do think and act differently, and they would say things that are differently. Somebody like Toby might not tell you the truth and be an unreliable narrator, but he doesn't know, so it's unreliable to him. It's only his truth that he thinks he's speaking. Whereas a character like Landon may deliberately lie to you to confuse you, but then throw in a stark element of truth that hurts, and you don't know if it's true or not. And he's a sociopath. He likes to
Yeah.
play with people, and he's got zero empathy for anyone that he comes across. So both of those characters are a lot of fun for different reasons.
Oh, they were both so interesting to read separately put together, because you're kind of guessing how this will all wrap up by the end of the book together. So you're wondering how they're gonna be related to one another in a sense. And I mean, walking away, I felt thoroughly more disturbed by Landon than I did Toby, because I did have that sympathy for Toby by the end of it, because you can recognize, oh, he just doesn't know. And it's like you have that cringe factor of when you're reading certain scenes, like, oh, you're not getting that, or oh, you're misinterpreting this, that, or the other. To whereas Landon, it's just like completely deliberate, it would seem. In fact, there is a scene, and I'm gonna do my best to not spoil it, but it is, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this
I
already.
know where you're going with
But
it.
just I have to ask, like, what was going through your mind writing that scene? Because I read it and I like put the book down and I was like, shut up. And I told everybody that I knew how to arc, I'm like, you have to read this immediately. I have to talk to you about this right now.
um, I had written I know the scene you're talking about, and I knew it was going to ultimately conclude with an altercation between Maureen and her fiance and his stepson, or and her soon-to-be stepson, that was going to drive her from the house. And I knew that's what I had to do. And I had written that scene, and I had written some stuff before it and some stuff after it. And it seemed a little cliche, like we've seen stuff like that before. And I'm like, what what what's missing here? And it wasn't until I went back and read my descriptions of Landon, and this isn't going to give much away. I don't think anybody will guess, but it wasn't until I read my own descriptions of Landon and I would describe him in all these animal terms. When he would yawn, it was like a cat. When he would slink across like a snake, he would go here. And I'm like, oh shit. I left breadcrumbs for myself to follow home. So that's what I did. I went back and said, "Here's how we're going to do this." And
There
Landon was like, "Yeah, yeah, that's me, man. Let's do it."
there was nothing cliche about that altercation or what started that altercation.
My
So,
only concern right after I wrote it was, I'm like, is it too funny or is it terrifying? I can't tell.
no, no. I
And
mean, it
maybe
read
both. Maybe
very
it's that weird.
terrifying.
I don't know what to react to this.
I think whenever you write something in that line, that nature, when it's so, the only word I can think is like unhinged. I know everybody throws that word around, but it really is. You're like, you don't know what's going to happen next. And it's already, the way that you wrote it was already a tense situation. And then it escalates to this, and you're like, oh shit, I don't know what to expect. There was no expectations to be had following that point. So yeah, mission accomplished there. But yeah, so that kind of, as it relates to Landon and Toby, that was a really interesting dynamic. And then, of course, we kind of had the grief cycle with our detective friend there. And then, for Maureen, her storyline is also really, really interesting. And you kind of talked about the cosmic nature of, the grief stuff that you've written before. But I think that there's a lot of cosmic lines in Toby's story and in Maureen's with her writing. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the like I don't know if you necessarily agree, but some of those influences in her writing her book and, moving forward.
Yeah, there's if it's cosmic with Marine, it has a bend toward the arts, I
Yeah.
guess. Like she's a writer. She's written one book years ago, um, and it's kind of people question her as to whatever happened to her career, and she doesn't really address it. And she's working on something now as our story takes place. And it's at first it starts off as this sort of ambiguous, unrelated element, the story that she's writing. And I use excerpts of her story in the novel itself. But then it kind of builds on what's going on around her and the situations with Landon, and it mirrors that. And then it towards the end takes off in a tangent on its own and kind of opens a door to what some of Maureen's issues actually are. And it's even it's brought to her attention by another character throughout points in the story who, there's a cosmic or spiritual
Yeah.
um element to that other character. But yeah, you know there are certainly filigrees
Mhm.
of the cosmic nature throughout this book. Nothing that, if you're looking for Cthulhu mythos, this ain't going to cut it. But
Yeah.
it certainly has that sort of, like you were saying, that first season of True Detective about what actually happened here,
Yeah.
and I think that's what this book does too.
Yeah, it almost reads as kind of like, like you said, it bends towards the arts, like a transcendence, like some kind of other outside force of these characters, and the way that the dominoes fall, whichever they may, is really, I think, a driving force of the novel. So it was really interesting to read because one, it makes the story not predictable, when you have that kind of ethereal feeling to it. And then the other thing is like it leaves some things I feel like a little bit up to interpretation. Like what this really meant to that character, like how do they really view that event that happened? Do you feel like your stories are really concrete and or do you feel like they can be interpreted in a way that's a little bit more open-ended?
I think they're definitely they demand to be interpreted.
Yeah.
I don't even my stories that have a what I would consider a pat, bow tied ending on it. There's always one strand of that bow tie that's loose, right?
Yeah.
And I think that some of that it comes from is based on the nature of how I write, because I don't outline it, I don't, and I don't plot all this stuff out meticulously. And the other aspect is it's deliberate because I don't think life works that way.
Yeah.
And I think there are elements to things that just are left up in the air. That's not to say that. That said, I also think that if someone cared to go back and read any one of these books that I write a few times through, all your answers are in there somewhere.
Hmm.
I just don't feel the need to hammer them over someone's head, and I like the idea that different people can walk away with different impressions. Senseless is, um, it's a perfect example of that. I don't want to give away any spoilers, particularly to how the book ends, but that was part of my pitch when I told my agent and my editor, this is the book I want to write, and here's how I feel it should end. And I knew that's how I was going to end it. Like, and I'm talking about
Yeah.
the grand, the murder mystery, if you will,
Yeah,
aspect
yeah,
of it.
yeah.
And I was waiting for them to go, oh, that's what you're going to do. You can't do that. But actually, and my agent was a little more hesitant. She tends to be a little, hey, Ron, don't be too crazy. My editor is like, he goes, no, I think you're the writer to pull this off. And so I hope I did.
Yeah.
We'll
Well,
see.
I would say that you did. And that kind of brings me to my next question too, which is a little bit broader about, pretty much everything that you write. I feel like it has some to some degrees more or less the element of crime, writing within the realm of crime, and then writing within the realm of, like you said, like the outskirts of horror, having some horrific elements, whether they're supernatural or not, and those kinds of things. And for me as a reader, I feel like when I'm reading crime or police procedurals, they're pretty literal, they're pretty logical. There's certain beats that you follow and there's a certain logic that you follow, but with horror, really anything goes. So as a writer, I feel like you do a really good job of marrying the two with many of your books, but is there a certain approach that you take with combining the two, or is it just naturally your style? Like what's your take on that combination?
I don't even actively, think about it when I'm doing it. And it's funny because I am probably one of the last guys to pick up a like a police procedural
Yeah.
and read it. I know much better authors than me have had much better careers doing series of books on police detectives and private investigators and all that, and that's great and a lot. But for me, a lot of the times the heart element is missing because this is what these people
Yes.
do for a living, and it's just a job for them, and I get that. I'm much more interested, and a lot of my books do come with me being a perfect example, I guess. Do exemplify the main character who is basically a fish out of water. They are not a cop. They are not a trained investigator, yet they're thrust into these situations where they have to be, and that appeals to me much more. um and I think that because I feel that way, that was what was preventing me from writing this when I just had the detective storyline, and
Yeah.
I knew something was missing because I didn't want to write one of those books. I wanted it much broader and richer of character than to just tell a crime drama or a police procedural or something like that. So, um, and I think that as far as blending those elements, I think it's just inherent in what you're doing. I mean, if you're going to have dead people, at some point the cop's going to be brought in, uh,
Yeah.
or and I think that a lot of times there's not really, you know, it's not my these books are never mired down in investigative beats.
Yeah.
I give you what you need to know, but it's much more about character relationships. If you look at the whole detective segment of the book that makes up the majority of the novel Senseless, very little of it focuses on investigative procedure. It is relationship, strong relationship based between him and the husband of the first victim, and where that goes. And that was interesting to me, like that dynamic about people who have to trust each other but maybe don't,
Mhm.
and that relationship continues to change as the story progresses. That sort of stuff interests me the most.
Yeah, for sure. And I tend to agree, like not to knock crime fiction or police procedurals, but I just found like I read a lot of them when I was younger and then I felt like I had figured it out and then I got bored because I wasn't as invested. So I think that that's really why I really enjoy the character-driven side of things, when we're not as bogged down with evidence and getting from A to B to Z, like all that kind of good stuff. And I think another good example of that is The Narrows, which I had read last fall. I really, really love that book. And again, you have another cop character who's not really in a role as like yeah, he's in a role as a law enforcement official, but we're not following him from crime scene to crime scene, bagging evidence and interviewing people and stuff like that. It's a little bit different. So I think that that personable level to it really does work really really well, and the horror of it all. I think really there's a lot of room to play with in there because I do find that there's like a tortured aspect to these people who find themselves around death so often. So I think that's kind of like a horror playground, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and the thing, like you bring up the Narrows, the thing about the Narrows is an allegory of a small town life, particularly a small town that's drying up, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to exist much longer. And the cop who's one of the main characters in that story is basically an embodiment of that town. He's someone who's also drying up because what's going to be left here after, he stuck around because his family was here. His father had passed on and he's living in his father's old house. And so I loved the symbolism of the town and this cop. And that's really what his story is, right? It's stuff like that that makes me interested in, right? It's the character piece of it. The investigative stuff is sort of a side note because that's what he does for his job. Um but yeah, so I mean, it's things like that that get me invested in the characters and makes me want to write about them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of wraps up like all of my really broad questions about Senseless and your writing. And I have kind of a fun question that I wanted to throw in here because I know that you're a music guy. So if you had to pick a song that kind of like imbibes the whole entire theme of Senseless or what it sounds like, what song would you pick and why?
Um, it's a good question because, like I said, it runs multiple different subgenres and they each have their own tonal qualities. I'm going to have to go with Talking Heads' Psycho Killer.
Oh,
I
I
think
love.
that I think that would fit pretty well for this book.
Yeah, I think that the quirky sound of that song fits a little bit with where this book ends up going. And you really don't really know, like I said, I keep saying it, but it's very unpredictable. And so I think that that
Pick that song because there's actually a Roy Orbison song that plays over and over again in the novel itself,
yeah,
but it's for a very specific reason. I wouldn't say it encompasses the whole novel. It's
yeah.
a very specific part. But yeah, let's go Talking Heads.
I like that. I like that answer a lot. Yeah. So but I'm gonna throw you a real curveball here. What would you say like for Come With Me or like The Narrows? What would those songs be probably?
Oh, I'm gonna Come With Me. I don't really know. Come With Me. Um, I wrote Come With Me after a friend of mine was killed in a shooting, and
Yes.
I didn't write to music when I wrote that book, and I was in a very particular headspace, so it's hard
Hmm.
to go back and then paint it with the
Yeah.
filigree of music, and that's a tough one. The Narrows, when I was the first draft of The Narrows was written when I was in high school,
Hmm.
and it was very different. It was very crappy, but it was written, and I listened front to back John Cougar Mellencamp's Scarecrow album,
Yeah.
and just all the small town songs on that thing. Just that was the soundtrack to writing that first version of the manuscript when I was a kid, and it stuck in my head when I went and revisited as an adult, and said, I think I'd like to revisit this town and actually write it well. Um,
And unfortunately, friends, that's when I lost connection with Mr. Malfi, which I feel absolutely terrible about, and I am so, so sorry. But also, these things happen, and there's only so much that we can do. And to be quite honest, I'm grateful for the 30 minutes that I got the man's time to ask him my burning questions about Senseless and his writing process and the like. And like I said, thankfully, it was the end part of the conversation and not the beginning or the middle. I did get to chat with Ronald kind of, off recording over the phone, and I asked him about what he's working on and what he's got coming up. Mostly now, presently, is a lot of senseless touring and book promotion, which, you can find on his social media pages. That's probably the best way to keep up with him is through social media, which I'll, of course, link in the show notes as always. All of his book events, the people that he'll be speaking with, the places he'll be, things like that will be listed there. I did ask him what he's working on, and he said he's working on a very, very long novel. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of pages. To which I said, hell yeah. To which he sounded a little nervous about maybe what his publisher would think. I personally, for one, me speaking, would love to read a doorstopper from him, kind of like the Stephen King esque doorstoppers of the 80s, just unhinged things going on and all the uncanny and strange unfolding. I really enjoy Ronald Malfi's writing, so literally, however many pages you give me, I will read them all. Um, but yeah, that being said, I can't really say much more other than that. But it is exciting to hear that something like that is in the works. Hopefully it remains in that shape. If not, hey, I'm just happy to get more Malfi in my hands. So, we'll see what it looks like in the future. But, in the meantime, Senseless is on shelves today. This is a book that I think really works well for both readers who enjoy the thriller genre, kind of like the murder mysteries genre, and then the darker side of maybe gritty crime fiction and its ties with horror, kind of the different narratives that take over, letting your mind wander, the really depraved places crime can take you. I think Malfi understood that assignment very, very well with this novel. And that's something that you'll see whenever you read it. So, with that being said, I mean, I can't recommend the book enough. I absolutely loved it. It's a little bit, it's one of his longer novels and I think that he makes excellent use of the space. It's one that is highly psychological and you will get in your head about it. You'll feel a little gross and you might want to shower after, but I think it's a high concept novel that'll leave you thinking, about the ending and what it really all means. So, with that being said, I don't want to give too much away. I need to just shut up at this point. um, in the meantime, next week, I am over the moon to be sharing my interview with Nat Cassidy as When the Wolf Comes Home is finally being released. I read this novel, I think, before Christmas, and I actually talked to Nat back in January. I've been sitting on this conversation since January. It's slowly been driving me insane, and I cannot wait for you all to hear it. I adore Nat. I am over the moon for him that he got a Stephen King blurb on Threads and Blue Sky this last week. If you're on social media, you probably saw it because the horror community collectively rejoiced. It's awesome to see Stephen King give Nat that kind of recognition, knowing how much King means to Nat. But what's even cooler is seeing how everybody knows it and is equally as excited about it as well. It's just so freaking awesome. And one of the reasons I really, really, really love this community. So yeah, be on the lookout for that conversation. And then I believe I have one more interview lined up for the month of April. And then I'm contemplating a hiatus. Maybe a month and a half long break. I absolutely, don't get me wrong, I love doing this. I love getting to chat with authors and sharing all of the intricacies of their work and their process. However, I won't lie, doing this as a one woman show, while also working full time, trying to keep up with reading, other extracurriculars, my social life, and also wedding planning right now is a bit much. So I might be taking a little bit of a break just to kind of kick off summer and refocus, regather before we get, kicked into high gear for horror season in the fall because everybody, loves to release a book around Halloween. Um yeah, I might be doing that. So stay tuned, that might be happening. But no, I at least have two more episodes to give you all, and yeah, I think that wraps up my updates. It's been a phenomenal time, as always, getting to share these kind of conversations with you, and I feel like I've been talking for way too long now. So I'm going to stop. Thank y'all, as always, for listening, sharing, promoting, being kind. I just love whenever you guys are kind out in the community to other people, to me, to my friends. Like, just spread positivity, man. It's a weird time to be living in the world whenever there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think if we can all be kind to one another, share a smile, make somebody laugh, do something really kind, it goes a long way. And that's what I've gotten out of this community. And I hope that's what you all have found as well. This has taken a sappy turn. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I just really care about you guys a lot. And thinking about taking a break makes me equally happy and sad. So that's probably where these emotions are coming from. But again, I'm going to shut up now. And I hope that you all enjoyed this episode, even though it was more me talking than we're used to. And we'll be back next week. See you guys.